Welcome to the EdPalooza session, our next public education imperative, elevating COVID-19's emergency remote learning to effective, true online school. My name is Allison Bazin, and I'm the Director of Communications at Pearson, and I'm really pleased to be here today moderating this conversation with all of you. I've been supporting Connections Academy full-time K-12 online schools for the past 13 years. And in that time, I've had the distinct honor to highlight the stories of students and teachers for whom online school has been the perfect fit, and at times even a lifesaver. Unlike presentations in the past, where I spent most of the time explaining online school, the events of 2020 mean that from here on out, I will likely be speaking to a very informed audience. We all know what happened. Starting in March, when COVID really started to hit, schools had to move to online learning practically overnight, AKA emergency remote learning. Some efforts have been good, some less so. And if you're Tilly, you give it a solid D. Over the summer, some schools regrouped, they upped their game, but for many, that still equates to Zoom calls, hours of Zoom calls, in an effort to replicate a classroom experience. Again, some efforts have been good, others less so, and we'll have a great opportunity to talk about that in the session. At Pearson, we've conducted several public surveys to gain insight into how the pandemic has shaped opinions about the future of school. And I just would like to share a few data points before we start our conversation. From our Global Learner Survey, we've learned that around the world, more than 3 in 4 people believe that education will fundamentally change as a result of the pandemic. We also spoke specifically to high school students and their parents. Overwhelmingly, these students and parents agree that the future of high school will include a mix of both online and in-person education. A whopping 57% of parents polled said that even after the pandemic, they plan on keeping their children in a remote online learning program. So it's an imperative that we all strive for what works best in online education. So today we're going to talk about a true online school experience versus emergency remote learning, and what is going to need to happen to make online learning better, to really elevate this emergency remote learning to something that a true online school delivers. So if you've just joined us, welcome. And while I introduce our guests, I'd like to direct you to the questions in the chat pod. I appreciate if you would leave an answer. The questions are, how would you grade the U.S. education system's response to the pandemic, the emergency remote learning? And then we'd love to find out what you think the biggest hurdles were, whether that is teacher training, access to the internet or devices, or access to quality online resources. Our moderated conversation will last for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions. But please do add your questions to the Q&A chat. So there's a chat pod for the room, and then there is a Q&A chat, and that is noted by the question mark. So let me introduce our guests. Mickey Revenaugh is co-founder of Connections Academy, one of the first full-time online schools for grades K through 12, founded in 2001, and now a global provider of K-12 online learning and part of Pearson. In Mickey's current role as Vice President of Online Learning and New School Models at Pearson, she's focused on bringing education opportunities, including those harnessing big data, artificial intelligence, and immersive technologies to learners worldwide. Previously, Mickey helped launch the E-Rate program to wire every American school to the internet and was the education technology editor at Scholastic. Thank you, Mickey. And Nik Osborne is General Manager of District Partnerships for Pearson's Online and Blended Learning Group, where he works specifically on partnerships with K-12 school districts to implement online and blended learning programs. He's been with Pearson since 2016 and has led various strategic, operational, and sales functions across the organization. While working with the higher education team at Pearson, Nik developed strategic business models, built a strong partnership and distribution network, and he revitalized business operations to create a more customer-centric experience. Previously, Nik has worked in administration and he taught at Indiana University. Welcome, Nik.
Thank you, Allison.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our questions. And I'd like to begin with a little bit of level setting. And Nik, I'm going to direct this question to you. We talk a lot about true online school with quotes and emergency remote learning with quotes. At a high level, can you talk a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we look at true online learning, we're really focused on programs that are designed to provide those services to families in an online setting. And so what that means is this isn't an afterthought in the sense of I'm teaching a lot of students face-to-face and oh, by the way, there's a couple of students calling in on the Zoom. This is actually the curriculum and the content and the course is developed to serve the needs of students in an online environment. And that can be done in a lot of ways. One of the biggest is providing both asynchronous or synchronous types of content and courses so that students can have a mix of live lesson and versus, hey, this has been recorded and please take a look at this as your leisure, as you're doing other things throughout the day. Another big difference is actually the curriculum that's used. Traditionally in a brick and mortar face-to-face setting, you're dealing with physical textbooks and you're teaching in that way. And we saw some districts try to take that and apply it in an online setting so that, hey, we're still using physical materials, but now I'm going to teach you in an online setting. That's not super successful. Like, and there's real curriculum that's designed to be consumed online and virtually. And that consists of the actual content itself, but even assessments and such that are real time and that you can interact directly with your students in that type of environment. So what we see is actually many districts are looking at this as this isn't an add-on necessarily to a brick and mortar setting, but this is actually a true online experience that we need to put forth a lot of effort and focus on for our online students. And then we also have what we call more of a brick and mortar setting that is taught in a more traditional fashion. And then, Mickey, I don't know if you had something to add to that.
Yeah, of course I do. So one of the things that has just become super clear in the time that we've worked on this sort of thing and became extra clear during the pandemic is that everybody's first instinct was to take sort of whatever was happening in their traditional classroom and just broadcast it onto the screen, which there's two challenges with that. I think, first of all, you could argue that that traditional way of teaching in a regular classroom wasn't always so successful anyway. I think really great teachers have been sort of tussling against that, chalk and talk front of the classroom kind of instruction for a really long time. And yet in the pandemic, that was everybody's first instinct was, talking head teacher on screen and kids listening, on the other side of the screen. And then the second thing is the built from the ground up online learning should be able to use the technology really well to do things like, personalized instruction for kids by capturing data and putting that in the hands of teachers. And it's not at all surprising that I think during the, emergency online learning, that wasn't the first thing people were thinking about. They weren't thinking about what great data can we scrape out of this so that, our teachers will be able to be more precise in their instruction. But, that's what folks should be thinking about now, now that we're not in emergency settings, but people are figuring out a way to make this a little bit more persistent and resilient. And yet I think we see over and over again that thinking outside the box isn't quite happening the way it probably should.
That's great. Thank you for that. And I would venture to guess that many people on this call today are seeing this firsthand. They see their children at home, and you have varying experiences from one child to another, from one school to another. There's a lot of variety in what's out there, and we'll talk a bit more on that. And Mickey, I have a follow-up question. As someone who's been around the online learning block, what surprised you most about emergency remote learning in the last several months? And what made you want to scream, "I told you so"?
I'm actually going to give the same answer to both of those questions, because the thing that surprised me the most is that people were surprised that some kids really thrived in this setting. I think, the headlines that we all heard and saw was how miserable everybody was teaching and learning online. And it was definitely a challenge. There's no question about it, especially as fast as it needed to happen with as little preparation. And then gradually over the summer and early into the fall, we started hearing about, well, Sammy and Susie actually seem to prefer being online. And, our student over here who's on the autism spectrum actually seemed to thrive in an online environment. And there's even some coverage about, students who actually found for the first time that they were escaping racist treatment by their teachers in that really subtle microaggression kind of way, where if you're a Black teenage boy fidgeting in your chair, you'll get reprimanded. And if you're a white teenage boy fidgeting in your chair, you won't. So those kinds of things, which we've seen evidence of the kinds of ways that students and teachers thrive in online learning for 2 decades now. So it wasn't a surprise to me, but it shocked me that it was a surprise to others. And so that also was the thing that made me want to yell, "I told you so," because, bottom line, we've been saying this in education now for a couple decades, like, one size does not fit all. Everybody learns a little bit differently. So why should it be surprising when, in fact, some students actually learn better in an environment like this one? So I bit my tongue quite a bit and applauded when people uncovered what seemed to be kind of a shocking news to them. Nik, I don't know if you've been spending a bunch of time with district folks. How does that look to you?
Well, I think your point is well taken. The concept of really the personalized learning path that we've been focused on for so long. I think from the other thing that I saw that was really interesting, and there's actually a correlation in the higher ed courseware field, is the lack of speed on decision making on what to do here. So when you rewind a little bit here, so forget everything that was going on in the world about moving online and moving digital in every aspect of our lives as consumers. Everything is moving that way, yet education seemed to be stuck in just kind of a mode of, we're going to continue to do things that we've always done since the philosophers would get up in front of people and teach. And so what was interesting is when COVID hit, obviously everyone was unprepared. The entire world was unprepared. So it's not even fair to put that on education. But from the time of February, March to when August comes around, you would have thought that folks in education would have seen this as, hey, we've got to move. Maybe we get a pass on how we finished up the spring 20 semester, but we've got to be prepared for fall because we know there's no relief coming. And it was interesting to watch districts not make decisions. And it'd be far easier to say, hey, you made a decision, it was the wrong one. But no, they waited and they waited and they waited. And there was a mix of looking for guidance from their state or federal government. And it was, what should we do here? And there was waiting. And then all of a sudden July comes and it's like, well, we better do something. And that's where we saw a lot of this. We've waited long enough and now we're going to try to put something together. And with the districts that we saw doing that, obviously the experience was really poor for their students and their teachers, frankly. The teachers weren't prepared. We had other districts actually that took let's say a more strategic focus, and they were prepared for 2-3 months. They'd implemented training and they were ready to go. What's interesting is that in education, we've seen the same thing in higher ed, where for the longest time, higher ed has kind of not wanted to push towards this online. And now it is really starting to move a little bit quicker with online degrees and such. It was surprising to me that did not correlate over to K-12.
Right. Well, one other thing that I think has been really surprising since the new school year began as well is how many families and what kind of families are actually choosing not to go back face to face or choosing their way out of hybrid. I happen to be on the board of a brick and mortar charter school here in Brooklyn where I live, which serves Brooklyn kids, right? You know, it's like 90% kids of color, probably 75% complex learners. It's sort of like the demographic that you would expect, you know, families would want their students to be back in the building. And the school worked heaven and earth to be prepared to have students back in face-to-face, including, you know, reconstructing every classroom, putting in all kinds of special, protocols for coming into the building, and open school. And 80% of their families elected to be remote instead, which was stunning. It was stunning to the board. It was stunning to the folks who run the school. And that had to do with all kinds of reasons, but mostly health and safety concerns and the desire not to have to go back and forth, to go into shutdown and back out. So I think those things are starting to have an impact as we go through the fall, and hopefully will make people think about how do we do this for the long run and how do we do it really right.
Great. And I'm going to add a data point here. I said I was going to chime in with some research, but one of the statistics, and this goes back to Mickey, something you said in your first answer to this, is 80% of parents said that they were handling the transition. I mean, it's not surprising, handling the transition better than the parent was. We know that this was about students and parents both going online, but just a child's comfort level with technology being so much more than the parent, that makes such a difference. So a follow-up to that, you know, you've both explained sort of the I told you so. Why were we not seeing innovation? What was the hurdle? What was the thing that was hanging people up in this transition?
I mean, I think I can speak from a district perspective. I mean, I think it's difficult. I think it's hard, and I especially when I think districts were faced with a blended environment, which is very different, right? It's not only do I have to prepare for this in-person experience, which is going to be drastically changed, right? Students 6 feet apart, masks, you know, how many are coming, how many are not, but then when you think about that from a teacher and administration perspective, the other thing they had to add on to that was, but oh, by the way, you're also going to have, you know, according to your data and according to what we saw, a fair amount of your students that are never going to step into the building. But you've still got to figure out a way to teach them and provide them with a similar learning experience as you would have if they had to step through the door. So I do think it's very difficult. And those that had never thought about it before or had never or did not have even a small online program in their district really struggled with making that transition because of everything else that they were dealing with, not only in their professional lives, but in their personal lives. And I think COVID was a very unique bit of a storm that really hit us on all fronts. And I think that was a major change that made it very, very difficult. I also think there's fear. I think there's fear of the unknown, and there's fear of being able to feel like you can really step out of your comfort zone, especially from a teaching and student and teacher interaction perspective, to am I going to be able to do this in a way that my students at home are a part of the class or are learning at the same pace that my other students are? And I think there was a bit of a fear there from feeling like they were prepared to actually do that in a very short window.
Early on in the pandemic, we hosted a webinar for teachers all around the world. We brought together Connections Academy teachers with traditional school teachers to help them. I'm telling you, quite literally, we had people on the first webinar, 1,000 teachers from Cairo, Egypt to Cairo, Ohio. And some of the things that they were struggling with were scheduling, engagement, resources. The schedule, that is so telling. Just how do I take a traditional school day and move it online?
Yeah, and I think there's also a probably well-justified fear, but possibly inadequately addressed fear about equity. that really kind of boxed a lot of teachers and schools in terms of their willingness or confidence to experiment with how they taught. And so anxiety around equity of internet access, obviously, is sort of like that's the baseline fear about that. Will all of my students have access to what it is that I'm doing? Will all my students be able to do independent work if I've never really given them a chance to do that before? What about my students that come with a little bit of baggage, either in terms of special learning needs, English language learning, or whatever it might be? And in an era where everything is so fraught in terms of just trying to keep it together for your students and your school, it's totally understandable that people would sort of default to very vanilla as a way of ensuring that it worked for everybody. And unfortunately, that doesn't really work all that well in a face-to-face classroom, sort of like, teaching to the great middle and not finding a way to really, personalize or individualize for students. And it totally doesn't take advantage of what technology can do. And so I'm hopeful that as folks do more and more of this and see what can be done and how their students are reacting to it, that they'll feel a little bit more emboldened to do some of those creative things that they would have done in a face-to-face classroom, that they've been sort of rewound out of doing when they've had to go online.
And that said, Mickey, part of one of the other things we found in the research was that families, and this speaks to what Nik was saying, families, even though they may be giving the American education system a low grade, they were giving their teachers high marks. They really were aware that their traditional school teachers were rising to the occasion and really, Herculean effort to get their kids online and to keep kids moving and learning. So yes, innovation maybe no, but effort definitely, and care was certainly there.
Something else to really consider when we talk about, maybe what was some preventative stuff, and you discussed resources. I think that's a real thing for districts, right? I think districts, for the most part, education as a whole, those budgets haven't been growing for districts, they've been dropping. And so how do you put together a strong online program, which is, again, if it's going to cost X dollars per student, but none of your regular costs have gone away. You're still running a physical school. You're still paying physical teachers and janitors, and there's things there that you have to pay for. And then this is an additional add-on. And how do you do that the best way? And again, I know a lot of our early discussions with districts, price and budget was a big factor, and how they were looking at how they can afford to do this. And then we're still having conversations with different districts in different states around CARES Act money. And how can I actually use this? What are the rules around this money, and what can I actually purchase that needs to be consumed this year versus next year? And trying to wiggle through that was also, there was a lot of confusion there. And again, I think there was a lot of districts looking for guidance that never really came. And that really put a stop on some of this.
So Nik, that leads me into my next question for you. So Connections Academy schools are already online. These are full-time online schools. How did the Connections Academy schools fare when things started picking up with the pandemic? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, you work specifically with the school districts. What did they want from you? What were the biggest requests for support? And if you could talk a little bit about how Connections did and district needs, that would be great.
Yeah, fortunately, the Connection Academy schools actually did quite well. So we, there was obviously a huge scaling up of interested parties, right? Everyone suddenly, at the drop of a hat, everyone in the United States was looking into virtual online learning. And so we were certainly making sure that we could implement our service structure at scale. But the great thing about the way our structure was set up is, to your point, we were ready for this. We had teachers in place, we have platforms in place, we had the structure of the schools in place, so that, yes, it's everything becomes more difficult when you add an extra, 100% more students. That can become a problem just from a scalability perspective. But the academies actually did very, very well and able to move that. One thing that we did see actually across the board was, when we look out at teachers and making sure we can have certified teachers across different states, there was times when there were shortages of teachers, and that's a big deal when we're trying to provide a really strong virtual setting for students. And we're very particular about the number of students per teacher ratio. We want to make sure that in our academies that the students have a strong ratio versus, just throw 200 kids in there with one teacher and let them go. Like we're really focused on a smaller student to teacher ratio. And so that was maybe the one piece where we had to do some additional legwork to get prepared. But overall, it's been a very, very good year. To your second question on districts, specifically what we have seen, it's actually interesting. It depends. One of the famous responses of it depends. Districts were a little bit all over the place, but they generally fell into three categories. That we had some districts that were really looking at this and saying, we just need content. We're going to use our teachers. We'll train them ourselves. We'll figure this out. We'll use Zoom. We'll use some form of online experience. We just need some content and curriculum. And oh, by the way, we can't spend a lot of money. And so that was really one bucket of districts. We saw another group of districts that saw this as what I would call either an opportunity or understood that they couldn't just approach this like they do with in-person students. And they looked actually at what I would call like a content and a service. So they were saying, we know we need online content, but we also know our teachers need help. And so what services can you provide to our teachers to prepare them to teach in a blended learning environment, and so that they feel good about how they're interacting with students in an online setting? So we had a good group of districts looking that way. We also had a number of districts that said, it was actually interesting, we're acknowledging that we can't do this on our own, and so we actually want Pearson to provide those resources. So we want teachers, we want platform, and we want content. And for all of our families that are actually interested in an online experience, we want you to provide that for them. And then, of course, your teachers will interact with our administration and teachers, and we'll make sure that's nice and clean. So we really had really in three buckets of almost a very, very light interaction and all-in interaction with Pearson.
So I would say the other thing that was maybe a little unexpected, but it was a gigantic and intensive lesson in empathy for literally everyone who worked at any Connections Academy school, or for those of us that kind of support those schools from a headquarter point of view. Because, we spend a lot of time talking about the important role of the parent in online learning and how to organize your day and how to organize your space. And overnight, all of a sudden, we were those parents, right? Our kids were home, right? And learning, however, their schools that they were going to were doing online learning, and seeing what a challenge that is, especially in those early days. So we often talk about the first month or so, the first 3 to 4 weeks of being in a full-time online environment, even one that's structured from the ground up to support you, can be like drinking out of a fire hose. It's really, really new. And literally everyone who has a kid or a grandkid or a niece or nephew that worked at Connections Academy experienced that firsthand. And so if nothing else comes out of all of this, we will have a deeper, more personal understanding of what it is that our families and kids go through, because we've seen it with our own eyes.
Right. We heard that online school families were saying, yeah, sure, school was the least disrupted part of my life, but everything else was disrupted. So your spouse is home, if you're a teacher, you have your own children home. So how you juggle, right? So let's move on to sort of the meat of the topic here today. And Mickey, I'm going to start with you on this. Again, we talk about emergency remote learning. This is what so many schools are doing right now. From your perspective, what needs to change to really elevate what's happening today to something more akin to a Connections Academy school, a true online school experience?
Well, I think we can't escape the fact that the table stakes, the first thing that we must do as a society and a country is address the digital divide. You mentioned that I was one of the co-founders of the E-Rate program, and we thought back in the mid-90s that wiring every school and library to the internet was going to hugely close that gap between the haves and the have-nots when it came to the digital world. And it did make a huge difference. But then suddenly everybody was at home. And so, I've spent some time with some educators that are basically saying, access to the internet is a human right. And we should just kind of embrace that as a country and as a culture and make sure that every kid has access to that. So I think that's sort of like the first step no matter what. Close second after that, I think finding a way to really expand the number of online learning options for schools, for families, for teachers, so that the choices don't feel so binary always between making it up on your own and at midnight when you have to deliver it at 7 o'clock the next morning, or getting something that's completely packaged that sort of doesn't really leave room for you. And I think we try in the resources that we create to put the teacher at the center, but arm them with the kinds of tools that they need to really go above and beyond what they could do face to face. Those kinds of resources aren't available to everybody. And I think making sure that we're just constantly driving towards expanding the kind and quality of resources that are available that will make online learning really work for all school settings. Nik, I don't know what you would add to the list.
Yeah, I mean, I think the piece that I'm still, pushing and we're still trying to engage with districts on is this really needs to be a transformational moment for districts. And, we still see some variation there. We still see some that are really just thinking, hey, vaccine's coming and we're going to get back to normal here. And, one of the cautions I think for districts that they really need to consider is we don't believe that online learning is going away. We believe it's going to explode. And we've seen it grow and grow and grow year over year over year. And the move to digital, the move to online, and again, every facet of our lives has done this, right? Remote working, right? Think about all of us are in some way, shape, or form remote working for the most part, and we're being successful. And we certainly believe that education is taking that leap as well. I think really focusing on this as that moment of transformation and not looking at this as a stopgap. I think that's the piece that I'm really trying to push with districts. And one of the things I often try to remind them of is, if you're a district, your families are truly your customers. And you need to think about your families as customers in the sense of, what are my customers, what are their needs, what are they interested in? Because I think for many districts, they have families, and the data continues to suggest, Allison, you shared something a second ago, that even with a vaccine, I believe the number of families that are still interested in online learning just is very high. So for districts, how are you going to provide that resource for your families? Because if you don't, the families will go somewhere. And I think that's what's super interesting from a district perspective is these families have options that aren't necessarily hindered by their geographical location. And I think for districts, this really needs to be that moment of, the future is more of a blended learning environment where absolutely there's going to be a lot of kids coming into a brick and mortar setting, but there's going to be a lot of kids learning from home or learning in this online environment. And how are you going to be prepared to meet their needs if you, again, consider them your customer?
Great. We only have a few more minutes before we start with the Q&A, and I would encourage you to add your questions to the question and answer section of the chat. I see we have, I think, 1 or 2 questions already in there. Mickey, maybe if you could clearly articulate this for us. We talk a lot about the promise of online learning. What is the promise of online learning? I think in this moment, it's probably easy for that to get a little muddy, right? So you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. What would you say, very crisply, is that promise?
So I remember when the very first computers were introduced to classrooms, and I worked with some great elementary school teachers who were the first users of the Tandy, whatever it was, in the back of the classroom. And they said, this will finally allow us to tailor learning to every student. This technology will allow that to happen. That didn't happen for like all of the 80s and into the 90s. With online learning, I think the promise is that actually that can happen. And I don't necessarily mean in a machine learning, artificial intelligence way, although certainly that can and should be a piece of it, but really much more kind of supercharging the highest value of teachers, allowing them to not be content deliverers, but to really have the data, the resources, the skills that they need to individualize learning and personalize learning for every kid. It also doesn't mean that every kid learns by themselves. There's so much that I think teachers learned about group projects that could be done online and how kids can collaborate with each other. But this idea of really understanding in a deep way what makes each learner tick, and then making sure that they have that on a daily basis, I think that's the promise of online learning.
Great. So we have a big shining star on personalized, tailored education. All right, my last question before we jump into the group Q&A. So let's imagine for a moment that it's 2023. There's a vaccine. The economy is recovering. What's different about K-12 education now compared to pre-pandemic or during pandemic? 2023. What is the 2023 what's it gonna look like?
So I think our view would be that it's a much more blended learning environment for students and families. And I think it's really focused around flexibility. And I don't use that term lightly, because I truly believe that those that have had a good experience with online learning, and again, not everyone has, there's been poor experiences as well, but the amount of flexibility for the families and the individual students it's amazing. And I can speak again from my own perspective with two kids of my own, just the amount of flexibility that my children have on a day-to-day basis. And we were fortunate enough to have a school district that put together, a very good online experience, both synchronous and asynchronous capabilities. And being a part of the district, my children can still be a part of extracurricular activities, but they don't necessarily have to go into a building for 10 hours a day. We're lucky enough to not have both parents that have to leave the home for work. And so being able to take advantage of that flexibility and have my children do other things throughout the day rather than sit in what I would call like a childcare scenario, I think is the biggest promise, and absolutely how I would hope 2023 starts to look like from a K-12 perspective.
All right. And we will hope that we will be well on our way to closing the digital divide at that point as well.
We might need to say 2025 instead of 2023, but what's a year or two after the one we've just been through, right?
Exactly. All right. So thank you for adding some questions to our question and answer chat. Let's start with this question about at the state level. What can state lawmakers do to improve the policy environment to support innovation?
Can I be the first person to say get rid of seat time?
Yes, elaborate on that.
So I live in New York, which I jokingly call the North Korea of online learning, because believe me, before the pandemic, it was not happening here. And part of it is because baked into the state funding formulas are the idea that students have to be physically in a particular place in face-to-face contact with teachers in order for your school to be funded, and measured very carefully, tracked very carefully over time. And so it was really the idea of, butts in seats, and that's how you measure whether learning was happening. What we've discovered through online learning is that the amount of time somebody puts into a learning experience does not equate to what they necessarily get out of it. So we try to measure attendance based on time on task, work completed, students moving through mastery of material, which gets a little bit closer to this idea of kind of competency-based learning as opposed to, time being the thing that measures everything. Time can be really variable, and it's the mastery of materials. That's a huge lift. I mean, every state has a different way of funding schools, but it all comes back at some level to seat time. Until we deal with that way of funding schools and reverse it, I think it's going to be hard to do anything deeply innovative.
Mickey, can I ask you also to talk a little bit about this vision you have for teacher training and how you have this vision of teachers being offered opportunity to innovate?
Yeah, so this is definitely a wild hair kind of thing, So it's if I could truly wave my magic wand. First of all, it's sort of based on the idea that the more kinds of learning experiences that are available to kids and families out in the world in general, the better. And the more variety of those are that are better, the better. And I think teachers should get additional compensation and or time away from doing their regular teaching duties to create and deliver those kinds of experiences that might or might not be in their school. It might be in their community or elsewhere. Who better to kind of come up with that incredible diversity and variety of experiences that I think we would argue we need in order to really meet the needs of all learners than the teachers who engage with them every day. Right now, if you asked most teachers to do more than they're managing to do, running their classrooms and manually grading homework and doing all the things that we ask teachers to do, very few of them would say that they have a lot of time for thinking creatively and differently. So either time within the week, sabbatical time, extra pay, whatever it might be, we need to compensate our most brilliant educators, of which there are many in every single school in every district in America, to come up with lots more great ways for kids to learn.
Nik, do you want to add to the question about what can state lawmakers do to improve the policy?
I think Mickey really hit some main points on her head. I would think just overall, like just a mindset of not looking at digital learning as you must be ABC just like in-person learning is, but actually having a more expansive viewpoint on what virtual learning truly is and how we can better measure it. Maybe to some of the things Mickey was talking about, seat time versus course completion and mastery. And there's tons of tools and software programs that can help and can provide that same level of experience for a student. And again, get us closer to that more personalized learning path for this student doesn't necessarily need to sit in a classroom for 65 hours or whatever the number is. This person, but because this child was able to master the content in 12. And I think that's the interesting perspective, but just really thinking differently about how the legislation views virtual programs, I think would be a good start before even diving into the specifics. And there was another question, Allison, in there around teacher prep. And I think right. Mickey started it. I think Mickey was hitting all over it around how valuable teachers are. And I would just echo those things as well. I mean, when we look at school districts and we, both from as a parent perspective and as a professional, the teachers are the single most important piece of this formula with students and student success. And making sure that they are put into a position to where they can succeed, whether or not that's additional resources, additional training, things to help them prepare to where they can interact with our children, frankly, in a better way. I think that is something that we have, almost as a society missed for a long time by not investing more into our teachers. And I think that's an error that hopefully we can remedy in the near future. But just a simple thing like moving to a virtual experience and ensuring that the teachers and their programs are preparing them to do that it would be a fantastic first step. So I wholeheartedly agree that that's something we should absolutely be investing in.
And actually, I'm going to add one more thing in about assessment. So before in the olden days, the before times, every school in America was really measured by the state standardized assessments that were already themselves trying to move towards being more formative than summative, more responsive to the way students are really learning. And not being this like cliff that you fall off of moment in time every year. The last spring pandemic canceled all the state tests, right? And I think it's still kind of up in the air what's going to happen this spring. We already saw that NAEP has been canceled, right? So it's a little bit of a moment of reckoning for assessment and how we think about assessment. And, like thinking ahead to 2025, one of the things I would predict is going to be, or 2023 or 2025, that I predict would be really different would be, how do we assess students' progress? How do we use the pretty sophisticated assessment tools that we have in a way that allows that, measurement of mastery that doesn't have to do with time that you spend in a seat? Those things really have to go together. And, I think we've seen that virtual schools have suffered a bit and been punished a bit by their really different ways of approaching instruction and learning and time by having this kind of one blunt instrument measure. So I'm hoping that as we recover, that we'll be thinking differently about assessment as well.
Okay, we have another question. Are there teacher colleges graduating teachers with the skills they need for effective online? So sort of your assessment of the teacher training programs at colleges across the country.
Mickey, I actually don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you do. So I'll hand it off.
There's the greatest hits places like Boise State, that I think have always been, sort of leaders in this, and they're ones that have sort of been scrappy in thinking about what kind of teacher force do we need to have ultimately in the world in general, and how do we start preparing them, and then sort of walking the walk, right, with having teachers learn online how to teach online by being students themselves. One really exciting new initiative that I know about is actually, believe it or not, Morehouse College. So, the iconic historically Black college in Atlanta that educates young men. There's a visionary former charter school leader who just started a department there that's focused on preparing the next generation of teachers for America's schools. And she's hitting two things at one time. One is preparing young people to be teachers in online and blended learning, and finding a way to make sure that the majority of those that are being trained are Black males, so that you're solving kind of two problems at one time that we see just over and over in America's schools. So I think we're starting to see that kind of innovation pop up in places that you might not expect it. I'd say the places that need to move a little more quickly to get there would be our kind of standard teacher training programs, the big state universities that churn out teachers by the tens of thousands. It'll be interesting to see how they respond to what's happened over the last year and start preparing teachers a little bit differently.
Great. And I'm going back to my data again, because I talked earlier about how families thought their teachers were delivering education in the midst of the switch. So we had 88% felt that their child's teacher was doing an okay job, but at the same time, 81% said that their teachers need more training. So there was this very clear understanding of like what was going on, what they were doing, was noble and it was working, but they really were very clearly aware of the need for more training.
Well, and I think one fallout that we're seeing from this, Allison, is just the teacher burnout numbers. I mean, the statistics that came out the other day about how exhausted teachers are, and it's the combination of having their own kids at home, having to teach in a different way, having policies change on a minute-by-minute basis. That I think needs to be addressed as well. And That's not a training issue as so much as it is of like a whole person wellness issue that school districts and others are going to have to figure out a way to really grapple with.
Absolutely. My sister happens to be a kindergarten teacher in central New Jersey. And she has basically created a television set in her basement where she is doing the replicating the traditional classroom, but it's like she has her little piano, her bookshelf, the whole thing. And she goes live for the kids, and the parents are appreciative. But again, it really does not embody what makes an online school magical, really, in this mix of very intentional synchronous and asynchronous learning, this very different use of time, a very different way of communicating with families and students. These are all big changes that we just aren't there yet. We just haven't done it. I think in an effort to just get things going, it ends up being the hours of Zoom calls. All right, I'm going to ask a question about learning loss because this seems to be a big question on many families' minds. Can you talk a little bit about why families are thinking this, what you think they're experiencing, and maybe how that might resolve itself?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really interesting is sort of like the headlines that we saw last spring about how everybody hated online learning. And now the headlines we're seeing is how terrible it was for kids' education. And there's no question that the combination of trauma, disruption, learning in a way that maybe wasn't really well set up for them and so on has undercut the learning of many students. But part of the problem is that we don't really have a super precise way of measuring this. I think a number of districts are using assessments like the MAP assessment to try to measure where students are and compare it to grade level. And if you have that kind of precision or that kind of instrument, and you can get really detailed about exactly what it is that the student is missing, you can go from making these broad brush statements of like half a year's worth of learning loss or a year's worth of learning loss to say, no, actually, it was that multiplication and division of fractions that this student didn't get. And if we spend a little bit of time zeroing in on that, not with the whole class, but with that individual student and maybe a couple of other students that are grappling with it similarly, then we can get over that hump and they'll be able to get back up to speed. That's the kind of thing that online learning does really, really well. So I think there's this sense of like online learning bad because learning loss happens when actually in a lot of cases really intentional online learning might be the solution as much as it is the problem. Allison, I think I mentioned to you that in the UK, actually, the government there has set aside £450 million for addressing the learning loss, the learning gaps that have happened over the year, starting last spring. And one of the uses that they're putting the majority of those funds towards is online tutoring sessions with students. So 1 to 3 tutoring delivered with students in school, but the tutor online to really address the very specific and very identified gaps that students need to fill in order to be able to move forward really effectively. That feels to me like a better approach to this question of learning loss, and one that we kind of have the tools at our disposal to deal with now.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think you raise a really good point, Mickey, and there's a little bit of a consider the source type of answer, simply because what were those children's experiences in this online world from March? Probably not good, right? So in March, when everything shut down, what was that experience like, and what kind of programs were they in? And I saw, and actually in my higher ed courseware experience, I saw a similar thing when it came to moving away from physical textbooks. It was, well, students can't possibly learn with a digital textbook, or they can't possibly learn as well with a digital online experience. And when we dug into some of those courses where we were trying to test some of that, what we found was a digital the students would all be required to use a digital textbook, but the professor would be teaching with their physical textbook in the front of the room and still lecturing in the same exact way as they had before. And so the the advantages of a digital version weren't being used at all. And half the time the students didn't even know what page the person was on. So I really think it depends on the program we're looking at. I'm not sure we have a good enough correlation yet to say that students that are in a strong online learning program with teachers that know how to teach in an online capacity using software and programs that are really designed in an online capacity, what kind of learning loss compared to if they were in a physical classroom. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Great, thank you. We have about 3 minutes left, and in that time, I welcome the audience to add any final questions to the Q&A. But I would like to ask both of you very briefly, who is doing really exciting things? Where are you seeing some super innovation? Like, wow, they're taking this time, they're taking this moment to do something they didn't try. Nik, perhaps it's with a district. Nikki, it might be something globally.
You want to go first, Nik?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have a handful of districts, Fort Smith, Cumberland, that have really been very forward thinking and proactive when it comes to this, and they're having very strong, successful programs. But again, they were early to this, and their decision to move with a virtual program wasn't COVID related. They were already going this way. COVID was an accelerator for them. And so what we have found is, yeah, there are lots of districts out there that are doing really exciting things and really thinking about this as a future state of blended learning, and knowing that they have families / customers in different needs, and they want to be able to provide those. And they're really looking at Fort Smith's a great example. When they went out to find a provider partner, they said, we want rigorous curriculum. We want to really focus on that for our online experience because we want the students to be challenged. We don't want this to be a click-through process. And so it's funny, the parents were actually like, man, this is really difficult. It's like, yeah, that's the point. We want the students to learn. And so I think we do absolutely have some of those transformational leaders out there that are really paving a new way. Absolutely. Mickey, I don't know if internationally?
Yeah, internationally. So really quickly, I happen to be doing some work with the Harrow School in the UK, which is like one of those like Hogwarts kind of places in the UK. Winston Churchill went to school there, that kind of place. And, like turning out masters of the universe, things seemed to be working well, even though it was very, very traditional. In the pandemic, they realized that they couldn't lecture from the front of the room anymore. The kids were not going to be able to pay attention if there wasn't somebody there with them in person. And so they started doing things like project-based learning, and immersive experiences and so on. And that is going to change the trajectory of what that school does going forward. And when schools like that are starting to look at doing things differently, then in some ways, the rest of the world will follow.
Wonderful. Well, Mickey and Nik, thank you so much for the conversation today. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your questions and comments. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. And thank you again for joining us. Reach out if you have any other questions.
Thanks, guys.